who we send into those big white buildings to make decisions on our behalf. And that if we get it right, our everyday lives will get better. That is why I'm running for president. It is why I'm asking for you to caucus for me in February, and it is what I believe that we can deliver if we get this right. So thanks so much for the opportunity to share this vision with you, and let's have a conversation.
I'm a transplant from Omaha. I've lived there for 40 years. Now, I cannot talk about long-term care in Iowa, but for 40 years in Omaha, on the front lines of medicine, I can tell you that it costs $3,000 a month for long-term care. And that is in a Medicaid facility. In a nice facility, you're looking at $6,000 a month. Your $90 is not going anywhere. After 40 years of nursing, I can tell you on Social Security, and I live on disability, I live on below the poverty line. How are you going to help me? What are you going to do? Because as a disabled senior citizen, don't look, well, red hair is scary. I'm over 60. How is that going to assist you? How can you help me? And I am a future former Republican.
Wonderful. First of all, my message to you and to every former Republican or future former Republican, welcome aboard. We're glad to have you as part of this movement. And you're right, the $90 benefit is important, but it's not enough. It's only part of what we've got to do in order to make sure that we address costs and increase access. You know, lately the debate about healthcare has been about the Medicare for all versus Medicare for all who want it versus ACA. Like that's the only thing that matters. If we don't do something about the cost side, we're going to continue to struggle no matter what. So what can we do about it? Well, part of it's getting the bureaucracy out of the system. Because Medicare as we know it, Medicaid as we know it, are still part of the problem of way too much of the healthcare dollar going into administration and paper versus into actual patient care. Another thing we've got to do is on the income side, and it's why we need to raise the minimum benefit from Social Security to a higher level. It's also why we need to make sure that we have the right kind of regulations to ensure that all care is quality care, no matter what your funding source is, as you go into those kinds of care. Part of that's on the provider side, making sure that we support caregivers, being trained in the right way and able to provide quality care. But a lot of it goes far beyond that. We've also got to make sure that we are building up more of a supply. Again, we're gonna keep aging. Nothing's gonna stop that. And we need to make sure that we have the right kind of resources and facilities and the reimbursement rates reflect. One other thing I want to mention, since you mentioned just how expensive these facilities are. If we can give somebody a chance to age in place, that represents a huge savings, and so often it also represents a benefit. Not for everybody. We've got to make choices based on what's right for the patient. But it should always be based on that, not based on a system that far too often, and I'm especially thinking about Medicaid right now, actually pushes you toward an institution rather than supporting you staying at home. And we see that kind of cost all the time. It winds up so often leading to worse outcomes. People are isolated. And then you got a caregiver who's got to drive a long distance to see a loved one, when it would be not only more affordable for them, but more affordable for the system if we had just found a way to give them a chance to age in place. It's why we've got to change that institutional bias that's built in to Medicaid in particular, but in some ways Medicare as well, and make sure that we support those home and community-based sources of care that we know can do such a good job, not only in treating conditions, but dealing with that social isolation that happens to people as they age, and often can take years off of somebody's life. So all of these things have to fit together. And thanks so much for speaking to that. And if I'm reading your T-shirt right, it sounds like you or your family have given to this country too. You have as well. So thank you for serving this country too. Thanks very much.
Hi, my name's Billy. Trump has promised to make E15 a year-round thing, but you can ask any farmer, you can't trust him. Would you commit to making E15 available year-round and open up those markets?
Yes, I support more E15, and I support making sure that a small refinery waiver doesn't go to the biggest oil companies in the world. As we know, they're talking out both sides of their mouth. And they got everybody's hopes up with the EPA, and then the guidance came out, and it turns out it's just more of the same. And we are seeing in so many ways, farmers here in Iowa and across the country being told, hey, take one for the team. It'll get better one of these days, we promise. And I think more and more folks are seeing through that. Whether it's on the trade war, where even when you get the checks, they're not making you whole for a lot of folks in soybeans, or whether it's on the corn side with what's going on with ethanol, the RFS, and the talking out both sides of their mouth on E15. And by the way, look, if you think about what it's going to take in the medium term to get to where we've got to get to as a country on carbon neutrality, we're going to have to make sure that our ships and our aircraft have a viable biofuel option. It's the only way to get from point A to point B. And I'm committed to making sure that the biggest purchaser I know of fuels, the Department of Defense, is doing its part to lead in market making for things that are going to improve sustainability in the United States.
My question is, I haven't heard you talk about this, and I haven't really heard anybody talk about it. I keep hearing people say that we should pay back school loans for students and so on, and I have a thought, and that is, well, number one, if our government does that for all the kids who had these school loans, what about all of us who paid our school loans, But my thought is, has anyone thought about going back to the days like we did in the Depression when we had the conservation corps? And why can't, if kids are going to go to school, technical school, whatever, maybe not even school, but some assistance to get employment, why can't those kids pay back by military service, or should they choose, perhaps they could go into reconstructing our highways or doing whatever. We'll feed them, we'll take care of them, their payment is their education.
Thank you. So I think it's a great point. And let me mention a couple things we've put forward that speak partly to that. One of them is, I believe in national service, voluntary national service. But the reason I think this is so important is not just the good work that can be done, but because we need to come up with more experiences that we share as Americans. The other day I was reunited with one of my soldiers who'd served under me, who's now become an officer. And frankly, he was the last person I expected to be at a rally for a Democrat, but he heard that I was doing something, and he came by to say hello. And it reminded me that when we were serving, even if we had nothing in common besides the flag on our shoulders, we learned to trust each other and like each other and work with each other. And I want every American to have that without having to go to war together. And the opportunity of creating 1 million paid voluntary national service opportunities a year is to recognize that maybe the military is not for everybody, but service could be. And I would count the time you spend in service as credit toward loan forgiveness. Now, we also have a program for loan forgiveness for those who go into public service in this country, but it is almost impossible to take advantage of. It doesn't even kick in unless you've been doing it for 10 years. It only works on certain kind of loans. A shockingly small percentage of the people who should qualify are even taking advantage of it. So I would retool that whole program to see to it that people get benefit right away, and then they see more benefit the more they serve, whether it's in the program I'm proposing, the national service opportunities I would create, or things that we already know are needed, including things like, I would also expand the definition of service so that when you have somebody who's, for example, providing medical services in a rural area that's at risk of losing their hospital, that's a form of service too. So I absolutely agree, and I think this is a big opportunity to do just that. Thank you.
Mayor Pete, my name is Susie Forrestal, and I'm from Council Bluffs, Iowa. My question relates to the Senate. As a lot of these great ideas are being proposed by several of the candidates, we all know that the Senate has been blocking necessary reforms, such as common sense gun reform. Why would you be the best candidate at the top of the ticket to change the makeup of the Senate?
Great question. Good. I'm glad you raised that because, look, there are all kinds of, sometimes I get the question in a different form, which is what would you do with this Senate? And I got some strategies on that, but that's plan B. Plan A is to have a Senate that looks nothing like the one we got today. But in order to do that, we've got to win. First of all, I believe that's why it's a good idea to nominate somebody who comes from the middle of the country. Who lives in a middle-class neighborhood in the industrial Midwest. If you go north, you pick up I-80, you take that 6 hours east, you're at my house. And traffic, maybe more like 8 hours. That's what's going on over in Chicago. And as you know, there's a need to make sure that we're speaking to the experiences of communities like my hometown that was an industrial city that grew up around auto manufacturing, then struggled after the auto factories closed, and also rural communities. And by the way, I completely reject the idea that we have to choose either caring about racial justice and social justice or caring about economic issues. If we speak to it in the right way, these issues are one and the same. When I'm talking about caregivers, guess what? Most of the caregivers we're going to give a raise to are women and workers of color. If we're talking about saving auto jobs, you know what? A lot of auto jobs where I come from are workers of color. We can pull all of this together into a common picture where everybody is better off. And we need somebody ready to speak to that. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, this is why it is so important to me to have an inclusive message. It's why I am calling out to people across the political spectrum. It's not that we're going to agree on everything, and I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. I suppose anytime you vote for somebody, you choose a mix of things you're completely on board with and things you maybe don't agree with, but the total package, you say, this is where I want the country to go. And that is what I see in the eyes of so many folks who maybe usually vote Republican, or at least don't view themselves as part of the Democratic tribe, but also are disgusted with what's going on in Washington today. And remember that the things we're calling for, whether it's higher wages, or doing something about long-term care, or delivering paid family leave, which is something else that would make a big difference for caregivers in this country, or doing something about guns. I know you're very active with Moms Demand Actions. You wouldn't know it looking at the Congress today, but at least something like universal background checks, that commands the support of most Republicans and most gun owners, not just most Democrats. We are right on the issues. And I'm determined to make sure that this election is about our lives. See, I think we all have pretty strong opinions about the guy sitting in the White House right now. But if all we're talking about is him, then we're not talking about you. I believe when we're talking about you, we are winning in the Senate, in the down ticket races, and all the way to the
Hi, I work nonprofit, child welfare, child mental health, and currently seems like our requirements by our guidelines keep increasing, but our funding is really stagnant, and it's making it really hard to keep really good people in there, which we really need for our kids. What's your plan to try to help us?
Well, first of all, thanks for what you're doing, because it's so critical. Especially that piece around, I think that deserves a hand. Especially that part around mental health. I'm talking to teachers across the state, and while there's a lot of work that we can do to help what's going on in the building, to support counselors, to make sure teachers get that mental health first aid training, you know, when a teacher has that training, they identify an issue, they still got to have a place to refer somebody to. And if the wait lists are such that you're just hoping they make it through the waiting period, and then they get to overworked, underpaid folks like you who are actually providing the services, that's no way to run a system for us. So it's why I'm proposing that we take several steps to support mental health care providers, especially those serving like children, like what it sounds like you're working on every day. First of all, we got to make sure that the reimbursement in insurance, whether it's private or public, supports the kind of services that we have and actually puts them in parity. Because it's one thing to have it on the books, it's another to actually require and enforce that the funding is there. And if the funding is there, more people will go into the field too. Second thing we've got to do is recognize the importance of helping underserved areas and linking up the in-person care, which is so critical, with things like telepsychiatry that can often provide a layer that saves somebody traveling to a specialist facility in a city. Knowing the stress that puts on parents. Not as a replacement for in-person care, but as something that happens alongside it. Another thing that I'm proposing is what we're calling healing and belonging grants. And the idea here is that often there are folks already working these issues locally who understand the different shape of the problems in different communities. I don't think all the answers ought to come from Washington, but some of the money should. And so these healing and belonging grants would be directed towards supporting a community plan that involves the providers, the nonprofits, the local government, but allows you all to put together the plan that makes the most sense given the needs here. Maybe in one county it's mostly a concern about addiction. And in another one, it's mostly a concern about something like lead poisoning. Different things that are affecting different communities in different ways. But also building up that sense of belonging that I think is beneath so many of the challenges that we have. If we get this right, we will motivate more people to get into being a provider, and we'll make sure that our communities are healthy. Look, the reality is, pound for pound, this will pay for itself. There's every bit of evidence that when we do a better job, especially for children, where an intervention early can make all the difference to their ability to succeed later. And by the way, if they do wind up on disability, we got to serve them better once they leave school, because we got a cliff. I mean, first of all, we got to fund the IDEA and support kids with disabilities in school. But when they leave into the working world, that's why we got to take care of the penalties that now exist and all the obstacles to getting SSDI. All of these things fit together, and we need to lead from Washington, but also empower those who are solving those problems right here on the ground. So thanks for watching.
My name is Rick Martinez. I immigrated legally to the United States over 25 years ago. I'm extremely grateful to the country. It's a fantastic country to live in. I have a family that I raised here. I have children I raised here. I'm a little nervous. However, you know, sometimes it's hard to feel like you're really welcome. You know, the Republican Party continues to call people like me, with my background, they call us rapists, they call us, drug dealers and stuff like that. So how, specifically speaking, how can we change our tone and make us feel welcome?
First of all, the rhetoric that you're seeing coming out of Washington, I do not believe that it reflects what's in the hearts of most Americans. And so hopefully you can be made clear that your community is glad that you're here, even if your president is part of it. And I think folks here too. And I think of those who come to this country not as getting a favor, but bearing a gift, because you contribute. You are a taxpayer. You contribute to the community around you, as my father did, who came to the United States, as you did, chose to become an American, was naturalized, and went on to become an educator, shaped thousands of students' lives, and of course helped bring me into the world. So I'm very grateful for that particular story of immigration into the United States. And that's what has to change in the tone, I think, is recognizing that immigration is part of the lifeblood of this country, always has been. Always has been. And it is how we grow, especially, in fact, in rural areas, where it's one thing to figure out a job growth strategy, and a lot of local economic development folks have been doing a good job at that. But sometimes the bigger challenge is a population growth strategy, to make sure we have the people to help a community grow. And so there are a set of policies that need to change. We got to change country caps that have no basis in reality. We got to change the bureaucracy and the waiting lists in the legal immigration pathway, like how you and how my father got here. We've got to create more ways to attract people here. So one of the things I'm proposing for rural economic growth is for communities struggling to build population, if they choose, to apply for an allotment of community renewal visas that would create a fast track to a green card for people who commit to staying in an area that's hurting for population. And I think a lot of areas would really benefit. But the biggest thing of all, again, is that tone. And it's part of what I'm talking about. This is a good note to end on, since I know our time's drawing to a close, about why we've got to attack this crisis of belonging in our country. People are being told that they don't belong. They're even trying to create a definition of belonging in America that doesn't include, doesn't matter if you're a citizen, they still tell you don't belong. Based on what language you spoke growing up, or who you love, or how you worship, or your race, or the different ways for different people. But that message is going out in so many ways. And it weakens our country. It weakens the very foundation of our country. Because the idea of this country is that everybody can contribute. And it is by virtue of what we have to offer that we belong. That is the story that we need to tell from the highest office in the land on down. It is the America I believe in. It is the America we embrace. You are part of it. We are glad you're here. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the opportunity to spend time with you. Thank you for believing in that inclusive America with a new sense of belonging. Together we can make it happen. We can change history. And if you help me become president, I will work every day to make you proud. Thank you so much for the chance to be with you. We will see you on the trail. Thank you. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you like this political content, please consider subscribing. Thank you for watching.